Episode 8 Professional Trustees versus Private Trustees. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain terms how trusts actually work in real family situations. For the last 20 years, my fiduciary work has focused almost entirely on the architecture of trusts, the skill of trusteeship, and the challenge of long-term family governance, not as a technical exercise, but as a human one. In doing so, I've advised hundreds of families, institutions, and advisors across the world. Alongside my advisory work, I'm a published author. I've recently completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and the human dimensions of both the fiduciary and the private banking fields. Now, before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is for general discussion only and does not constitute legal or professional advice. You should seek appropriate advice in your jurisdiction before taking any action. So let's start on the comparison of professional and private trustees, the two types of people who carry the burden of trusteeship. The choice between professional trustees and private, or as they are sometimes called, lay trustees, is one of the most consequential decisions in any trust structure, and it's one of the least examined. I've been both, have taken over and handed over trusteeship from and to both, so I am uniquely positioned to comment. In many cases, the choice of trustee is made quickly, emotionally, or by default, and then left unchanged for decades. That is rarely wise. There is no universally correct answer, of course. Every option involves a trade-off. Every choice creates risk somewhere. So the purpose of today's session is not to persuade you toward one model or the other. It is to help you see the trade-offs clearly. So let's begin with definitions, because confusion often starts here. A professional trustee is a person or an organization that acts as trustee in the course of a professional business. So, typically, this is a regulated trust company, a bank or private trust company, a licensed fiduciary, or a professional services firm. They usually act for multiple trusts across multiple families as part of an institutional framework. They can have hundreds, if not thousands, of trusts that they provide trustees services for. A private or lay trustee is an individual acting in a personal capacity. Often it's a family member, a close friend, or a trusted advisor, such as an accountant or a lawyer. They sometimes act alone, sometimes alongside others. Now, legally, there is no hierarchy. In other words, both professional and private trustees hold the same legal office, owe the same fiduciary duties, and face the same potential liability. The law doesn't lower standards because someone is well-meaning, nor does it raise them simply because someone is paid. What differs is not the role, it's how the role is supported, experienced, and sustained over time. So let me illustrate what competence really looks like and why it matters more than status or intention. This example illustrates how trustee choice must respond to circumstance, not how one model consistently outperforms the other. And this is from one of the chapters in my book, Trust. Some years ago, I was asked to review the trust arrangements of a Greek shipping family whose wealth spanned nearly a century. The founder, Alexandros, was already in his 90s when I met him. He was frail in body, perhaps, but unmistakably sharp. He'd built his business without fanfare, without politics, and without shortcuts. As a child refugee in Piraeus, he learned competence early. He mended fishing nets because poorly repaired nets cost fishermen their day's income, so precision mattered. By the time he entered shipping, competence had become instinct. He kept clean ledgers, balanced manifests, and knew where responsibility lay. He was never the loudest in the room. But when something went wrong, he was the one who could fix it. That reputation carried him through World War II, Reconstruction, and expansion. Not brilliance, execution. Decades later, that same ethic shaped how he approached trusteeship. The family trust, created years earlier with good intentions, was beginning to strain. Not because of conflict, but because of its complexity, multiple jurisdictions, different levels of involvement amongst children, new regulatory pressures. Advisors had been engaged, reports produced, meetings held, but no one seemed to have joined the dots. Alexandra saw the risk immediately. He recognized it from his business. It wasn't legal failure, it was operational drift. He asked the questions that others avoided. Who checks this? Why does that entity still exist? What happens if one's ship is sanctioned? What happened if one's son disengages? He wasn't looking for clever answers. He was looking for competence. What followed was not dramatic. We rebuilt the structure methodically. Assets were ring-fenced, roles clarified, and reporting tightened to ensure that someone always knew what was happening and why. The family considered appointing a trusted relative as sole trustee. Loyalty was not in doubt, but competence was. And in the end, they chose a professional trustee, supported by family governance structures. Not because professionals are superior, but because continuity, systems, and follow-through mattered more than familiarity. So when Alexandros died, there was grief, but no scramble. The structure held. Decisions continued. The family argued, as families do, but the trust did not wobble. That outcome was not the result of affection or heritage. It was a result of competence. In a different family, with fewer jurisdictions and stronger internal cohesion, the conclusion might well have been different. So that's the point this episode exists to make. Trusteeship is not a symbolic role, it's an operational one. The law doesn't lower the bar because a trustee is well-meaning or related. Competence is what protects families when individuals change, markets turn, and scrutiny arrives. Alexandros understood that truth his entire life. Do the work properly, or don't do it at all. Trusteeship is no difference. But there are circumstances where the opposite conclusion, in terms of trustee selection, is not only appropriate, but necessary. Some years ago, I became trustee of a small trust established after a young British soldier was killed in Iraq. It wasn't a sophisticated structure, no tax engineering, no cross-border complexity, no layered holding vehicles. It was a simple act of loyalty. A group of former comrades had raised funds discreetly to support his widow and 4 children. Now, on paper, a professional trustee would have seemed the safer choice. There were vulnerable beneficiaries, long time horizons, emotional complexity. But what the trust required was not institutional infrastructure. It required proximity. The widow didn't need polished reporting packs. She needed someone who understood why asking for help felt like failure, and also someone who understood the military. The children didn't need formal governance frameworks. They needed continuity, someone who remembered their father not as a beneficiary description, but as a man. So every single decision in that trust returned to one question: what would he have wanted? There was no formal letter of wishes, only stories, memories from fellow soldiers, recollections of his decency, his pride, and his steadiness. And that relational knowledge mattered. When a school uniform arrived, it was not just an expense. For me, it was a question of dignity. When a boiler failed in winter, it wasn't maintenance. For me, it was a question of stability. When one daughter called to ask about joining the army, the conversation wasn't administrative. It was, for me, mentorship. Now, a professional trustee could have executed the same payments, but the impact would have been different. Private trusteeship, in that context, concentrated responsibility rather than diffusing it. Decisions were personal. Accountability was direct. There was no committee to defer to, no compliance team to buffer discomfort. When a decision was made, it carried the weight of memory. And that concentration sharpened my judgment. It also created something else that institutional trustees often struggle to replicate: moral continuity. The trust didn't feel like an external mechanism. It felt like a family promise being kept. And over time, that promise evolved. The original beneficiary family stabilized. The children grew up. The widow rebuilt her life. The trust's remit was modestly extended to assist a handful of other regimental families in similar hardship, not through expansionary ambition, but through fidelity to the original intent. You see, as a private trustee, I understood not only the legal mandate, but also the culture of the military, the unspoken code of dignity, the reluctance to ask, the difference between genuine need and wounded pride. That kind of judgment can't be systematized. It depends on listening to pauses in conversation, on recognizing hesitation in an email, on knowing when to act swiftly and when to hold back. None of this suggests that private trusteeship is in any way universally preferable. It is demanding, it carries emotional cost, and it exposes a trustee personally. But in certainly family, particularly when assets are modest, relationships are central, and intent is deeply personal, relational knowledge is not a weakness. It is the stabilizing force. In those contexts, proximity does not blur duty, it animates it. And that, too, is trusteeship done properly. So it's worth addressing a common assumption at the outset. When trust failures make headlines, many people instinctively assume that it was because it had private trustees, friends, family members, individuals who are well-intentioned, but out of their depth. Sustained misappropriation tends to arise where time, complexity, and distance from consequence coexist. The issue is not whether a trustee is private or professional. It's whether authority is concentrated, accountability is diffused, and incentives are misaligned. Private trustees also bring something that professional trustees often struggle to replicate, and that's visibility. A private trustee can't hide behind committees, internal memos, or rotating relationship managers. Their decisions are, by default, personal. Their accountability is direct. Their reputational exposure is immediate. This doesn't make them infallible, but it does make misconduct harder to sustain. In many of the most serious embezzlement cases I've been involved with and advised on, the problem was not lack of sophistication. It was just too much distance between the decision maker and the consequence. So why does this choice matters more than families expect? Well, families often treat trustee selection as an administrative step, a box to tick, a name to insert. But in reality, trustee selection is a governance decision. It determines how decisions will actually be made, how conflict will be handled, and how resilient the structure will be under pressure. Most trust failures are not drafting failures. They are trustee failures, not because trustees are dishonest, but because they are overwhelmed, conflicted, unsupported, or simply human. Once appointed, trustees are actually quite hard to remove in practice. Even where removal is legally possible, the consequences can be destabilizing. That's why the decision to appoint them in the first place deserves more thought than it usually receives. There's another reason this choice matters so much. Trustees don't merely administer wealth. They become part of the family's institutional memory. Over time, trustees accumulate context. They remember why a decision was taken. They recall what alternatives were rejected. They understand which compromises were deliberate and which were accidental. This memory becomes increasingly valuable as the original settlor fades from view. Professional trustees preserve this memory structurally through files, minutes, internal review, and continuity of systems. Private trustees carry it personally, in their heads, in their relationships, in informal conversations that are never written down. So when a private trustee steps down, much of that memory simply disappears. Families often underestimate how destabilizing this loss can be. Decisions that once made sense suddenly begin to look arbitrary. Past compromises are revisited without understanding their origins. Continuity is not just about people remaining in place. It's about reasons surviving beyond those people. Now let's look at cost, because this is usually one of the first questions raised. And there is visible and there's hidden cost. Professional trustees charge fees. They're explicit, regular, and visible. Private trustees can often appear cheaper. Sometimes they charge nothing at all. That contrast is misleading. Professional trustee fees buy infrastructure, systems, compliance, record keeping, internal review, continuity, institutional memory. They also buy something less tangible but sometimes crucial, which is procedural discipline. Private trustees often bear cost differently, but there is a cost. They bear it in time, emotional energy, opportunity cost, and stress, and sometimes personal financial exposure. Private trustees rarely price their time properly. They underestimate the burden at appointment, and they often discover it only when something goes wrong. When disputes arise, professional trustees typically defend claims through institutional indemnities and insurance. Private trustees may face legal costs personally, even if ultimately vindicated. Costs should therefore be assessed over the life of a trust, not at its inception. A cheap trustee who resigned under pressure or creates conflict through inexperience is often the most expensive option of all. So let's look at competence now. Because competence in trusteeship is not about intelligence, it's about exposure. Professional trustees make decisions every day, are better able to recognize recurring patterns, understand where risk tends to hide, and know better how regulators and courts think. They develop judgment through repetition. They also tend to be cautious, sometimes frustratingly so. But that caution is not inertia, it's learned behavior. Private trustees bring a different form of competence. They understand the family, the personalities, the history, the unspoken context. They know which conflicts matter and which are performative. They often sense when a decision will cause disproportionate damage, and that insight can be invaluable. It's also important to recognize how trustee types influence family behavior. Families behave differently when they know a professional trustee is in place. Requests tend to be framed more carefully. Expectations are moderated earlier. Disappointment is absorbed institutionally rather than personally. But by contrast, when private trustees act alone, boundaries are often tested gradually. Small requests, informal conversations, assumptions that discretion will bend just this once. None of it's malicious. It's human. But over time, the cumulative effect is significant. Private trustees often find themselves negotiating constantly, rather than deciding periodically. Professional trustees, by contrast, tend to force issues into formal decision points. And that difference shapes how families experience the trust itself. One environment encourages negotiation, the other encourages governance. And neither is inherently wrong, but they feel very different to live with. Private trustees often struggle most when family relationships deteriorate. The trustee role doesn't pause simply because relationships are strained. The strongest arrangements recognize that no single trustee embodies every strength. And that's why mixed or hybrid structures are now increasingly common. There's an imbalance that deserves attention as well in how trusteeship is usually discussed. Professional trustees are commonly associated with systems, regulation, process, scale. Private trustees are more often associated with familiarity, personal knowledge, relational trust. Over time, these associations have hardened into assumptions about safety and competence. But those assumptions are only partially accurate. In practice, neither model is inherently superior. Each concentrates risk, just in different places, and each manages responsibility, just in different ways. Professional trustees are often viewed as a natural choice for complex or mature structures. Their appeal lies in infrastructure. They bring continuity beyond individuals, establish procedures, internal review, and the ability to absorb regulatory and administrative burden. These features make them particularly well suited to multi-jurisdictional trusts, long time horizons, and situations where consistency must survive personnel changes. Private trustees, by contrast, are often chosen for their closeness to the family and their understanding of context. They bring memory, familiarity, and insight into personalities, histories, and unspoken expectations. In trusts where values, intent, and relational dynamics matter as much as technical administration, this proximity can be decisive. So the distinction between the two models is not about diligence or integrity, it's about how the responsibility is held. Private trusteeship concentrates responsibility. Decisions are personal and visible. Authority and accountability sit right next door to each other. That concentration can sharpen engagement and sharpen focus, but it can also increase emotional load and personal exposure. Professional trusteeship diffuses responsibility. Decisions are embedded in process. Oversight is shared. Continuity is institutional rather than personal. This diffusion can provide resilience and defensibility, but it can also distance decision makers from consequences. So neither structure eliminates risk, it just manages it differently. Where failures occur, they tend to reflect structural conditions rather than trustee type. Sustained misappropriation, for example, requires time, complexity, and distance between action and detection. These conditions are more likely to arise in large, layered environments. By contrast, errors in private trusteeship more commonly arise from misjudgment, boundary erosion, or role confusion rather than concealment. It's not a judgment about character. It's a reflection of scale and design. Behavior around trusteeship is also shaped by structure. Professional trustees tend to encourage formality. Requests are framed through process. Decisions are justified by reference to policy and precedent. This can slow outcomes, but it also imposes discipline and consistency. Private trustees tend to operate through relationship. Conversations are far more direct. Context is assumed rather than articulated. This can enable responsiveness and nuance, but it can also blur boundaries if not handled carefully. Both dynamics influence how beneficiaries experience the trust. One emphasizes governance, the other emphasizes judgment. Families often prefer one style over the other, depending on temperament, history, and expectations. Another important distinction lies in authority. Professional trustees derive their authority from their office. Their legitimacy rests on mandate, regulation, and role clarity. Private trustees derive authority from relationship and trust accumulated over time. Their legitimacy rests on shared understanding and continuity of intent. Now, both forms of authority are fragile in different ways. Institutional authority can feel impersonal and provoke resistance. Relational authority can erode if relationships deteriorate or expectations diverge. Neither is inherently more stable. Stability depends on alignment between the trustee model and the family system it serves. Continuity also operates differently. Professional trustees provide continuity of structure. People change, but systems persist. Decisions are recorded. Rationales are archived. Successors inherit files and frameworks. Private trustees provide continuity of perspective. They remember why decisions were taken, not just how. They recall the pressures, constraints, and compromises that shaped outcomes. This qualitative memory can be invaluable, but it's vulnerable to loss when individuals step aside. Both forms of continuity have value, and most trusts need elements of each. Risk and liability are similarly balanced. Legally, trustees are held to the same standard, regardless of status. In practice, professional trustees manage risk through insurance, oversight, and process. Private trustees manage risk through care, engagement, and restraint. Each approach has limits. Neither offers immunity. So what tends to increase risk is not the choice of trustee, but ambiguity, unclear roles, poor documentation, misaligned expectations, informal decision-making without records. These failures can occur in either model. Motivation also differs. Professional trustees act as part of a vocation. Their incentives are professionalism, reputation, and duty. Private trustees act by choice. Their motivation is often personal commitment to the settler or to the family. Both motivations are legitimate, but both can fail under pressure. Professional trustees may simply step away when a trust becomes untenable or doesn't fit in with their risk profile. Private trustees may endure longer than is healthy. Each tendency carries risk. Taken together, those differences suggest a simple conclusion. Trusteeship is not a question of professional versus private. It's a question of fit. Fit with the family's dynamics, fit with the assets, fit with the complexity, fit with the time horizon, and fit with the kind of authority the family will accept. Some trusts are best served by professional trusteeship. Others function better with private trustees. Many benefit from a combination of both. The mistake is not choosing one model over the other. The mistake is assuming that one model solves problems that are, in reality, structural and human. Trusteeship works best when responsibility is consciously placed, actively supported, and periodically reviewed. Labels matter far less than behavior. One of the key points is how each reacts under pressure. Because the real test of trusteeship is not routine administration, it's pressure. A large distribution request, a business crisis, a divorce, a family rift, a tax inquiry. Under pressure, differences between professional and private trustees become stark. Professional trustees tend to retreat to process, they document, they take advice, they slow down. This can feel obstructive, but it's protective. Private trustees often feel pressure to resolve matters quickly, to smooth relationships, to preserve harmony, and sometimes that instinct does serve the family well. But sometimes it leads to concessions that undermine the trust long term. Neither approach is inherently right, but families must understand the behavioral tendencies they're appointing. Now let's look at continuity and the problem of time. Trusts are designed to operate across time. That raises an uncomfortable question. Who will still be here? Professional trustees are built for continuity. People may change. The institution remains. Files are transferred. Decisions are reviewed. Successors are trained. Private trustees are mortal. They age. They become ill. They lose interest. They die. And succession planning for private trustees is often overlooked. When it's addressed, it's usually reactive, a sudden resignation, a death, a crisis. And at that point, continuity is already broken. Continuity is not glamorous, but it is central to whether a trust achieves its purpose. Families who underestimate this often pay for it later, in disruption and in conflict. Now, one of the central skills of any trustee is independence, and, as I call it, the ability to say no. Independence manifests differently in professional and private trustees, and each form has distinct strengths and vulnerabilities. Professional trustees have no personal history, no emotional investment, and no need for approval. They can say no. That ability is often underestimated. Families rarely value it until they need it. Private trustees may struggle here, not because they lack integrity, but because relationships exert pressure. A sibling trustee, for example, is not just a trustee. They're a brother or sister, a friend, a parent. That dual role is difficult to sustain under strain. Many private trustees report that the hardest part of the role is disappointing people who they care about. Professional trustees disappoint as a matter of course. It's part of the daily job. This leads to an important distinction. Families often say they want trustees that they can trust. What they usually mean is trustees they feel comfortable with. But comfort and effectiveness are not the same thing. Trusteeship is not about trust in the emotional sense. It's about trustworthiness in the fiduciary sense. A trustee can be entirely trustworthy and yet, at the same time, deeply uncomfortable. They may insist on process. They may slow decisions right down. They may refuse requests that feel reasonable if taken in isolation. So professional trustees are often selected precisely because they are comfortable being uncomfortable. Private trustees are often selected because they are comforting. Both qualities have value, but confusing them leads to disappointment. Families who understand this distinction earlier tend to make better appointments. There is, however, a counterweight that deserves equal attention. Professional trustees can also fail in ways that are less visible but equally corrosive. Process can become armor. Let me explain. I've seen trusts where beneficiaries have stopped engaging entirely, not because decisions were wrong, but because they felt predetermined by policy. Every request required memoranda, every distribution required external opinions, and over time discretion narrowed not through intention, but through habit. The trust became defensible, but it ceased to feel responsive. In one structure involving entrepreneurial siblings that I knew, the professional trustee insisted on preserving capital rigidly, despite clear evidence that modest, well-governed risk would have strengthened the family's long-term position. Now, the trustee wasn't wrong legally, but they were misaligned strategically. The result was frustration, disengagement, and eventual litigation driven by perceived inflexibility. So, institutional trustees are designed to manage risk, but they can also institutionalize fear. Where personal accountability is diffused across committees and compliance teams, the emotional weight of decisions can diminish. A refusal becomes procedural rather than reflective. A distribution becomes mechanical rather than contextual. This isn't misconduct, it's structural inertia. Families sometimes interpret this as indifference, and once that perception takes hold, trust erodes quickly. Professional trusteeship, like private trusteeship, requires vigilance. Systems cannot replace judgment. Protection cannot eclipse purpose. Process must not become a substitute for courage. Now let's look at risk and personal liability. Legally, risk is the same. In practice, it is not. Professional trustees are structured to manage risk. They carry insurance, they have internal oversight, they have escalation mechanisms. They are cautious by design. Private trustees are exposed personally, their home, their savings, their reputation. Many accept trusteeship without fully appreciating this. And once accepted, disengaging is harder than expected. Resignation feels disloyal. Continuation feels dangerous. This is one of the most common trustee traps. Risk is not just about what might happen, it's about who absorbs the impact when it does. It's also important to distinguish between different kinds of failure. Most private trustee failures arise from misjudgment, not malice, poor record keeping, inconsistent decisions, emotional drift. Most large-scale trust asset losses arrive elsewhere. They involve concealment, complexity, and time. They require systems that allow wrongdoing to persist unnoticed. And those systems are far more commonly found in professional environments than in private ones. Both models fail when oversight weakens. The mechanisms may differ, but the consequences do not. I'd like to circle back to something we mentioned before, which is emotional load, because this is one of the least discussed differences. Professional trustees are buffered. They operate behind roles, procedures, and teams. Private trustees carry emotional weight directly. They absorb frustration. They hear grievances. They are blamed for outcomes that are beyond their control. And over time, this can distort judgment. Private trustees run the risk of becoming either over-accommodating or over-defensive, and neither is healthy. Professional trustees are not immune to stress, of course, but they are less personally entangled. That distance is often what allows them to remain effective over decades. There's one further issue that deserves explicit attention, and that's expectation drift. Trustee arrangements rarely fail because the wrong people were appointed at the outset. They fail because expectations evolve in different directions. Families change faster than trustee frameworks. A settlor who once valued restraint begins to prioritize responsiveness. Beneficiaries who once accepted discretion now begin to expect predictability. When this happens, pressure does not present itself as a formal challenge. It presents itself as tone. Requests become more frequent, frustration becomes normalized. Professional trustees tend to notice this early. They sense a shift in language. They see the change in behavior, and they often respond by reinforcing process. Private trustees, on the other hand, often absorb the shift personally. They accommodate small changes. They rationalize exceptions. They tell themselves that this phase will pass. Over time, the trust changes character. Discretion becomes expectation. Governance becomes negotiation. And the trustee's authority becomes ambiguous. This isn't because private trustees lack competence. It's because proximity has an awful sense of blurring boundaries. Expectation drift also explains why trustee changes are so emotionally charged. By the time a change is contemplated, expectations have already diverged significantly. Trustees feel criticized. Beneficiaries feel unheard. Settlors, if still alive, feel misunderstood. At that stage, replacing a trustee feels like judgment on the past rather than preparation for the future. The healthiest transitions happen early, before frustration hardens, before positions entrench, before governance becomes personal. This requires a high degree of honesty. Honesty about what the trust now needs, rather than what it once was. Honesty about whether the current trustee arrangement still fits that need. Families who approach trustee choice as something that may evolve tend to experience far fewer ruptures than those who treat it as a permanent designation. Now, I've mentioned hybrid and co-trustee models before, so let's dig a bit deeper into that. Very few trusts begin with the same trustee arrangement they end with. What works is during the settlor's lifetime may not work afterwards. What works for young beneficiaries may fail as they mature. What works for a small asset base may collapse under scale. Changing trustees is always disruptive. Relationships are reset. Historical decisions are revisited. Confidence wobbles. Professional trustees manage transitions routinely. Private trustees experience them as personal events. This is another reason why families often move towards professional trustees over time, even if they began with private ones. The shift is not an admission of failure. This is often a reason why families move towards professional trustees over time, even if they begin with private ones. The shift is not an admission of failure. It's often an acknowledgement that the trust has entered a new phase. Designing trustee arrangements with transition in mind often reduces friction later. Increasingly, families combine approaches: a professional trustee for governance and continuity, a private trustee for family insight, or a private trustee supported by a professional co-trustee. These arrangements can work extremely well, but only if the roles are clearly defined, authority is genuinely shared, and conflicts are acknowledged openly. Ambiguity is fatal. If the professional trustee defers too readily, discretion erodes. If the private trustee dominates informally, independence disappears. Successful hybrid models are explicit about who decides what. They treat governance as design, not assumption. So let's be candid. Many trust disputes involve private trustees, not because they are less ethical, but because they are more exposed. Family disputes tend to crystallize around the person closest to the family. Professional trustees are more often criticized than sued. Private trustees are more often sued than criticized. This is not fair, but it's real. Families should understand this when appointing someone they care about. Trustee can strain relationships beyond repair. That cost, the cost of friendship, is rarely priced in at the outset. So what have we learned in this episode? Firstly, the professional and private trustees hold the same legal office and owe the same fiduciary duties. Secondly, the trustee selection is a governance decision, not an administrative formality. Third, the cost is far more than just fees. Professional trustees charge visibly for infrastructure, systems, and continuity. Private trustees may often appear more inexpensive, but bear hidden costs in time, stress, and personal liability. Fourth, the competence arises differently. Professionals develop judgment through repetition and exposure. Private trustees contribute context, memory, and relational insight. Fifth, that independence manifests itself in distinct ways. Professional trustees are structurally positioned to say no. Private trustees may find refusal harder when relationships exert pressure. Sixth, that continuity and risk manifests differently in institutional and personal trusteeship. Seventh, that expectation drift is real. Families evolve, pressures accumulate. Trustees who do not revisit fit and authority find governance turning into negotiation. Eighth, that hybrid models can work well, but only where authority and roles are clearly defined. And finally, that trustee choice is rarely permanent. What suits one phase of a trust's life may not suit the next. Conscious review is a feature of good governance. And that is professional and private trustees unpacked. Join me in the next episode to unpack the role of the settlor and how this key person can retain influence without control. Until next time, I am Alexander von der Fellen.